Matthew chapter 24, along with its parallels in Luke chapter 21 and Mark chapter 13, is among the greatest sources of Bible end-time prophecy. But there are many that believe that Matthew chapter 24 speaks of events that, at least in most part, have already fulfilled themselves in the 1st century AD with the siege of Jerusalem between 66 and 70 AD. Among the reasons that have many to believe that Matthew chapter 24 mostly fulfilled is verse 15 and the following verses from verse 16 to verses 21, which appear to be historical events actually having occurred, and they been prophesied by Jesus 35-40 years before. Matthew chapter 24 KJV, verse 15. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whose readeth, let him understand. Verse 16. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Verse 17. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Verse 18. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. Verse 19. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. Verse 20. But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. Verse 21. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. Verse 15 to 21, referring to the second temple of Jerusalem, its abomination of desolation, its destruction of the city, destruction of the nation of Israel and its people, persecuted, both early church and Jews, murdered, taken into slavery, and left without a nation, scattered across the known world of the time, appearing to be all prophesied by Jesus 35-40 years before in Matthew chapter 24, in verses 2, 15 to 21, verses specifically referring to the second temple of Jerusalem and siege of the city in 66-70 AD. Matthew chapter 24 has over 31 verses on future events prophesied by Jesus, beginning from verse 2 and then continuing on from verse 4 to 31. Additional verses beyond verse 30-31 refer to the times, conditions, and circumstances of Jesus' second coming, but without giving any date or that of how long the church would have to wait for his second coming, or the when of his second coming. Among the reasons that have some to believe that Matthew chapter 24 was fulfilled in the 1st century AD is in how the verses are numbered in this chapter, with verse 15 in the middle of the chapter, and it a chapter of 31 verses. And because verse 15 speaks of an historical fact actually having occurred from when Jesus prophesied it 35-40 years earlier, and it being Titus's abomination of desolation of the second temple of Jerusalem before destroying the temple in 70 AD, verse 15 could be an indication of the timing of these events prophesied by Jesus and they of the 1st century AD. When it comes to the generation of these events, it appears that in verse 34 Jesus is referring to his generation of the 1st century AD, and it a 70 AD year generation, which is a Bible generation, beginning from Jesus' birth in 0 AD to the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and end of the Jewish nation in 73 AD. Or even a 35-40 year Bible generation, beginning from Jesus' crucifixion in 33 AD, ending with the siege of Jerusalem in 66-70 AD, and the end of the Jewish nation in 73 AD. Matthew chapter 24, verse 34. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. But others believe that Jesus was not specifically referring to his generation, but a future generation from the 1st century AD. Yes, maybe. But by what evidence? Where the events of Matthew chapter 24 were not fulfilled in the 1st century AD, or that they still to be fulfilled in a future generation. Because when it comes to evidence, it appears that there is more evidence that Matthew chapter 24 was fulfilled in the 1st century AD than in any other future generation from the 1st century AD. In fact, there has not been a generation in 2,000 years that came so close in fulfilling Matthew chapter 24 than the 1st century generation, and this because of verse 15 and the following verses that appear that of the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, just 40 years from when Jesus appears to have prophesied them. Many believe that Jesus prophesied another abomination of desolation in verse 15, and it of a third temple of Jerusalem, and that is still to be fulfilled, and not that abomination of desolation of the 70 AD abomination of the second temple of Jerusalem. Jesus prophesied the future abomination of desolation of the third temple of Jerusalem, skipping that abomination of the second temple of Jerusalem, which came 40 years later from his prophesying it, skipping the siege of Jerusalem, destruction of the second temple, the end of the Jewish nation, and the deaths of most of its population, survivors, if not escaped before the siege, taken as prisoners and sold as slaves across the known world of the time. Jesus would have skipped all this to prophesy a future generation of thousands of years later. This will not make much sense. Unless the main focus of Matthew chapter 24 is not a second or third temple of Jerusalem, but something else, an evil present all over Matthew chapter 24 from its beginning to its end, an evil that can only be stopped by the second coming of Jesus Christ. But this would mean a whole new understanding of what is the Matthew chapter 24 generation, a generation where abominations of desolations are the least of troubles of this generation.